nearly a decade after its independence in 1947, preceded by nearly 2 centuries of colonial plunder, India quite remarkably began taking tentative steps toward what is now an important global hub of space sciences and spacefaring. Chronicling India's extraordinary journey as a country on decades long engagement with space is the well known science journalist and writer Dinesh Sharma. Dr. Sharma has just published his richly detailed book, Space, the India Story, that offers readers a ringside view of how the country's pursuit of space as a source of transformative science has evolved. He spoke to MCR from New Delhi. Welcome to Mayank Chhaya Reports, Dinesh. It's a great pleasure to have you again.
Thank you.
We are just 2 days before the 64th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin of the erstwhile Soviet Union becoming the first person to journey into space. You, quite like me, are a child of the beginning of the space era. I was born in 1961, so I'm quite familiar with that era. What are your memories of that? You do refer to it in your book, Space, the India Story.
Yeah, in fact, we are having lots of anniversaries, a series of them, I suppose. The more remembered in India was the 40 years of Rakesh Sharma going to space. Last year it was. So
Right.
this is the 41st year. And yes, I think 60s was a very, I would say, I mean, going a bit nostalgic, it was a good period to grow up. And it was an exciting time, I would say, because science held a lot of hope, and there was something which was unknown. Okay, we are going to win over outer space. Man is going to land on the moon, and it was kind of a thrill of a new field emerging. So, I mean, surprisingly, if you come to think of it, Yuri Gagarin and Tereskova and all these astronauts became household names, and that was not the era of internet or even televisions in India. So only what we came to know about them was through newspapers and magazines, and to some extent radio, I would suppose. And
Right.
one reason for, I think, the Soviet astronauts getting big play in India, now if I think of it and you would agree, was the huge kind of, I would not call it influence, but access to information from USSR. We had the Soviet Land magazine freely available everywhere, and that kind of a thing. So people are more tuned to that, and there were graphic accounts in the magazine of how this happened and about their lives and all that. So I think that was pretty exciting time to remember, both from the point of view of exploring a new horizon, a new field opening. And there were also, I remember, a number of debates whether, science is a boon, that kind of school
Right.
debates used to happen, that can it solve all our problems, and should man be really going and winning over the outer planets? Is there life, in other places? So I think there are a lot of excitement, questions, and curiosity. I think that kind of remained in the people who have grown in that era. And of course, it continued in the 70s. But that excitement, I suppose, in the 60s was really something to
Absolutely.
remember. And also, it was a political thing in the sense it was seen as an international endeavor, at least to a
Right.
great extent. Space was, although it was a rivalry, would land on moon first, but it was more or less seen as an international endeavor. A lot of countries were just beginning their space programs, and so overall, I think it was a great period, I would say.
Yeah.
And so,
It-
yeah, so those memories are there in the back of my mind.
yeah,
When I look
in a
back at the records, and I found that, so it's kind of a public imagination of a new science, I would say.
Absolutely. In a sense, we were in the Soviet orbit in those days. So Soviet land and those things were always around, these journals. Unlike a lot of American magazines, these were easily available, and yet Neil Armstrong became an icon in India.
Yes.
Yeah. Talk a bit about how remarkable it was for a country emerging from 200 years of colonial plunder.
not to mention several centuries of invasions. India under Nehru did such an exceptional job of setting up a clutch of scientific research institutions, all of which you refer to. And the work from those institutions all flowed into India's space program.
I think it was, if you look back and you see that there's something remarkable about space, both space and atomic energy, and I feel more for space, was for a country, as you mentioned, just out of the colonial rule and very the kind of things which you cannot imagine today. I mean, today we take space technology for granted. You have satellite beaming television to you, and you're using GPS. It's part of our life. But think of a time when there was nothing, and imagine a country which was so technologically backward. Of course, we were good in science. We had a Nobel Prize in 1929, and so we had a
Right.
good tradition of science. But technology-wise, India was a laggard, I would say. I mean, even basic infrastructure, basic use of technology. For example, the whole country had just a few lakhs of phones. So, very rudimentary, basic infrastructure was not there. Use of technology was not there, and scientific institutions were just being built. Of course, universities had some good institutions, but this whole idea of creating national labs, organizing science, that was just beginning. And to think about space, which was again an emerging area in the 50s. Sputnik went up in 1957. People were talking about the possibilities of outer space. So at that time, to think about science itself, forget about for a second space and atomic energy, to think that science can address some of the basic problems. That was a bold vision, I would say, of Nehru and people who surrounded him, the scientific advisors like Bhabha, Mahalanobis, Bhatnagar, and to redirect. Of course, scientists always wanted to do their own work, build their own institutions, and go after scientific pursuits. But to redirect that enthusiasm and energy of doing science to something which can solve your national problems was a grand vision and a bold vision which very few countries saw that. In fact, if you go back and see Nehru's time, he was mocked in the parliament. He was, criticized outside parliament. There were, cartoons in newspapers drawn that is atomic energy going to solve your problems when you're having bullock carts on roads. So, despite all that, so that was a condition in which we started looking at space and science in general. And of course, the conditions to do science were again very difficult. There was a huge crunch of resources. The nation building was on. The research institutes were set up. Universities were IITs were being set up. So there was a huge crunch on the available resources. So that was one of the reasons that the program became sort of international in its nature from the beginning. You had help coming from America, you had help coming from Russia, USSR. So that was also out of compulsion because we didn't, have that kind of internal resource generation, I would say.
Right.
So in all this, the difficult circumstances of doing science, we went for it and it was a gamble. And of course, there were a lot of hurdles which we can talk about
Right.
as we
Sure.
proceed. But the whole idea that space and science and atomic energy could solve. I mean, imagine Baba convincing Nehru for grants, saying that one day you are going to have atomic energy solve your electricity problem. So that was the promise of science, and many of that has been delivered. If you think of
Absolutely.
the kind of space, the contribution of space technology to various sectors in India today is tremendous. But that vision was there, and that's how we began. And to translate that, we had taken a number of steps.
Right. In this specific context of space, you write about Lloyd Berkner, an American physicist who was behind the idea of the International Geophysical Year, IGY, who met Prime Minister Nehru in January 1957, barely 10 years
Yes,
after independence,
yeah,
reflecting the importance of India's participation in it. Tell me a little bit more about that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, because see, if you think about, of course, Nehru had that vision, and he was directly overseeing the work of the scientific Department of Scientific Research at that Ministry of Scientific Research. It was part of Education, Scientific Research, and Culture. So he was the minister in charge. And besides being the administrative head, he keenly took interest in the specifics of the program, like appointment of new directors, what are the international programs India is going to participate. Then Mahalanobis used to send him list of foreign scientists who could be invited to India to on lecture tours, the science congress sessions, who all could come. So in that context, he met the founders of the International Geophysical Year. So it was seen as India's participation in a big upcoming program. Of course, nobody thought that it will ultimately lead to India becoming a part of the processes. So I think when we talk about scientific research, it's also the processes. I think that's what fascinates me as a writer on science and technology policy and
Right.
history in India. That of course we all remember 15th August 1969 as the starting date of ISRO, but the processes which went behind that, it goes back to 57 and even before that. So I think
Absolutely.
that is the whole context of these meetings. I mean, there were personal letters written by Nehru to several scientists, which Baba and Mahalanobis would suggest, and they would write, and people who used to come and the Indian Statistical Institute had a lot of foreign faculty. In fact, people would come and stay and teach, because that's what Mahalanobis is convinced that all my students cannot go to America or Europe, so why not bring them out here? So there was a proper program of inviting foreign scientists. So at the highest level we had that. So I think that led to, because uh, science that time was seen as an international endeavor, a lot of cooperation. People had a lot of promise that the war has ended, and let's cooperate and
Right.
do things that we can do. So in that spirit, it happened. So otherwise, we didn't have educational institutions in India who could teach. Forget about space technology. We didn't even have proper teaching of basic engineering that needs to go into a program which can lead to space or atomic energy, because you need machines. Any kind of work you need to do, you need machines. So they had to fabricate their own machines because imports were difficult. So that kind of thing. So one way to overcome these challenges was to open yourself up to foreign
Right.
flow of knowledge. People were sent out on UNESCO scholarships. People went to American universities, and when Sarabhai was planning to start a space research program much before ISRO was formed, they sent out letters to Indian embassy in America, which put out ads in newspapers in certain areas that India is going to start a space program, so Indians could apply for that. And in fact, the first lot of people came that way. They were all recruited, interviewed in the embassy by whenever uh, Sarabhai went there, and so a
Right.
lot of people were recruited there. So that was a way to overcome your deficiencies, build knowledge, build bridges, learn things. Then once they were here, people were sent out on fellowships to ISRO, sorry, to NASA and other places. The first lot of six, engineers, including Kalam, went to NASA. So that kind of to gain first-hand knowledge. I mean, nobody was transferring you technology at that time, but to at least go and see how things may function. You may not have got equipment or machine from there, but at least you saw how things happen. People saw the satellites being launched. That was
Right.
the
Right.
experience which we gained, and that's how the human resources, I would say,
We're
the
created.
knowledge
Yeah.
skills were acquired and built.
Attached to IGY, the International Geophysical Year, is sort of the emergence of Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. I think he was the one who was sent, right, as part of that.
Sorry,
No,
he was the one.
wasn't Dr. Sarabhai uh, sort of deputed as part of the IGY
Yeah,
from India?
no. So it was International Geophysical Year, for which there was an Indian committee to
Okay.
coordinate with that, and there were several scientists who were asked to make proposals to that committee. And they went there and attended these annual conferences. Then they started meetings on space sciences after 57. In fact, the idea that an artificial satellite should be sent out was generated at one of these scientific conferences of IGY, where India was also a participant when both America and USSR started working. So, yes, Sarabhai was part of the team which went ahead
Okay.
and participated in many of these deliberations. People from National Physical Lab were there. But remember, Sarabhai was still in PRL, which was an
Right.
entity outside government. So an arrangement was worked out that he would represent space research to become a subject of Department of Atomic Energy. There's a little, I will not say conflict over there, but see, it was also a kind of, scientists close to Nehru wanted to build, labs around their, own networks. Like, of course, Bhatnagar was very close to Nehru, so he built several labs. But Bhatnagar died very young, 1955. So CSIR kind of slowed down. So after that, it was thought that Atomic Energy, Department of Atomic Energy, headed by Bhabha, would become the chief, scientific agency. And so there was, I have not come across any tussle, but there is a hint that, see, atomic energy was also a subject under CSIR initially before it became part of DAE. So that was taken away from CSIR, if you like to put it that way. Then space, it is a new area. So who should take care of it? Whether should it be CSIR or Department of Atomic Energy? And initially it was with CSIR because NPL was the main lead agency, I would say, National Physical Laboratory headed by Dr. K.S. Krishnan, who was a collaborator of C.V. Raman in the discovery of Raman effect. So he was a towering personality. So in IGY, the deliberations were led by NPL scientists, and Baba was part of the committee, which went ahead and participated. So he was pretty much in the
Right.
negotiations, scientific conference. But then after Krishnan's death, I suppose that was a very critical year in 1961, and when IGY was kind of formalized, and then it suggested that every participating country should have a national committee for scientific research. And that question was settled by Bhabha. And I think at that time, the subject sort of moved away from CSIR and moved to Department of Atomic Energy.
I see.
And because PRL was not a government entity at that time. So, and Sarabhai was working in PRL. So it was housed in Department of Atomic Energy, and funds were transferred to PRL for space research. So it was very initial stage where
Okay.
the subject moved from CSIR to atomic energy. I mean, it's an academic debate. It could be in today's context. Should it have remained with CSIR or but yeah, that's not a relevant topic today.
Right. Right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
then it moved to, and the committee was housed in Department of Atomic Energy, and ISRO was also formed in 1969 as a unit of atomic energy. It didn't have a separate budget for a couple of years, and only after 71 it became an independent department.
Right. You made a reference to resources crunch. There is an interesting aside to it in your book. You talk about two of Henri Cartier-Bresson's photographs, which went on to become iconic. One showing scientist C.R. Satyu carrying a rocket cone on his bicycle, which was, I mean, I have that image in front of me. It was quite
Yes,
remarkable. And the other was two scientists sitting on the floor, one of whom was wearing his vest because it was so damn hot, and that
yeah.
happened to be Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. So resources crunch were manifest across the board. It looks funny now, but I'm sure it was a great challenge for them.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was as I said, the funds were flowing from Department of Atomic Energy, and there were several, one of the reasons which Baba wanted to be away from Delhi and have the department, it was the first government of India department to be set up outside Delhi, was to be away from the bureaucracy. So of course, still bureaucracy could create hurdles. So there were issues with funding, there were issues you have to justify, and how to get go ahead, and things like that. And the iconic images which we see were of initial days when they were at the Tumba Equatorial
Right.
Research Station, where launch pad they were building on these sounding rockets in the church building. That picture was taken in the church building, So yes, those were the issues, and there were a lot of kind of exciting moments. Also, I would say that of course, people carrying on a bicycle is one of those things, was that from the place where they had to assemble these rockets and where they were made, there was a distance of 2-3 kilometers, and that was the only way to move, so that people moved
Right.
on cycles. So yeah, and there's another iconic such picture which is not there in the book, is about a satellite being carried on a bullock cart.
Ah,
That was in the
indeed.
late 70s and early 80s. But that was a deliberate kind of a test.
Right.
See, they had to do certain test in an electromagnetic free environment, and to create that kind of facility in India would have cost millions of dollars, or to take the satellites to the facility wherever it would have been cost much more, and it would have taken a lot of time. So this idea that the same test can be done if by carrying the satellite on a bullock cart, which has rubber tires,
Right.
and it was that environment was sort of created and data was generated, and in fact that paper was also published that the results were found to be good. So that refers to kind of a frugal way of doing things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they could have thrown their hands and saying that, okay, unless we have this great facility for $3 million, we are not going to do that. But yeah, that so because the program was born out of from scratch, and people
Right.
are doing things with their own hands, and getting things done in various ways, they thought of this ingenious solution after say, even 10-15 years of that picture being taken in
Yeah.
Tumba. So that frugality, I suppose, is a very important way. It is not as if they couldn't afford; it would have taken time, or whatever it is. But to think out of box, to do things, that has remained ingrained in,
Indeed.
I would say,
Indeed.
in ISRO's culture. I would say.
Yeah. Speaking of ingenuity, you also write about the launch of the satellite launch vehicle 3, and one of the remote controlled umbilical cords of the rocket refused to detach as planned. And the countdown was paused, and as a
Yes,
technician, suddenly
yeah,
climbed up the launch tower in defiance of all safety norms,
true.
and somehow detached the cable in time, and the launch
Yes,
then went. I mean, it's quite a picture if you look at it. So someone
absolutely.
climbing up and detaching the
Yeah,
cable, really facing sort of mortal danger.
yes. So initial days, of course, all those problems were there, in the sense when you're doing things for the first time, you come across several hurdles, and there are a lot of unknowns. Even today, space is a risky business. So yeah, those chances were taken, but I mean, you can't think of that today because there are a lot of safety
Right.
norm protocols and all that. But initial days they could do that, and there was a particular context to doing that, and that mission was crucial, and that also
Absolutely.
shows the kind of dedication people had, because to launch a complex system is a teamwork, to have a mission, to design it, to design a rocket, to get it ready, get it to the launch pad. And there's another team building on the designing of the satellite. There's a third team building on, the controls and navigation and, avionics and things like that. And then somebody is tracking. So it involves several teams, including hundreds and thousands of people. So a technology like space is not a job which a scientist or a technologist can sit in his own lab and do with a small team of people. It involves a lot of people. So
Right.
there are also a lot of chances of things going wrong. So one has to be very sure. So I think that is the process which they learned. SLV-3 was a great, see, rocket of all the components of the space technology, rocket is the most difficult and most crucial. As you know, if you don't have a rocket, you may have a satellite, but you can't launch it.
Right.
So, yes. satellite has its role, applications have its role, they are equally important, but most crucial technology is a rocket, and that's where I think ISRO spent almost 10 years from 1971 till SLV went up in 1980. They were working on satellites. Aryabhatta was launched from USSR. They worked on other satellites. They worked, on applications. We had the site
Right.
experiment where you could receive data. So applications we were working, satellites we were working, but we took a lot of time to master the rocket technology, because it
Absolutely.
involves a lot of industrial engineering, it involves a lot of integration, it involves multiple factors. So that's where some of these initial problems arose. Yeah. Of course,
Right.
things went wrong later also, as I described about ASLV.
Right.
With every first new generation, we had that problem, but yeah, that's part
Absolutely.
of the learning. That's another facet of ISRO, is that they always learn from their failures. Failure is, as Kalam said, is one way of learning. Because you're going to perfect what you're good at by learning from your failure. They have an extensive system of failure analysis. Several teams, discuss. So that is again a part of how ISRO works. So apart from teamwork, they have all these systems which are in place. To analyze every bit of it. Even a small wire, a connector, anything can go wrong, and it can bring down the satellite, or mission can end in a failure. Yeah.
Yeah. We are in the 45th year as a spacefaring nation, considering that the SLV was launched on July 18th, 1980. Tell me about
Yes.
the evolution of the SLV or the SLV program to the ASLV, which is Augmented Satellite Launch Vehicle, because that meant the latter could carry bigger payload, such as bigger satellites, for instance. I mean, it's quite a leap from the SLV to the ASLV. We'll come to the first two failures after that, but first tell me about the SLV ASLV evolution.
Yeah. SLV to ASLV was an evolution, because that was a necessary step they had to do, because SLV was, as we know, was an experimental flight, experimental rocket, in the sense that it could not carry heavier payloads. The capacity was very low, because if you wanted to do anything with communication or remote sensing satellite, you needed a bigger thing. So they put boosters on SLV, and this was tested. But
Right,
the critical part of was the mastering the liquid engine technology. That was critical, which went into uh, making of the future rockets. And that was, see, an important thing to remember with ISRO is that they are working in parallel on different rockets. While SLV was underway, there were already teams thinking of the next generation. While ASLV was underway, they were already thinking of the next generation, which is the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, which could really make a launch an operational satellite. So in parallel, these developments were going on, and they were feeding on each other. For example, when SLV was developed, there were already teams from India working with the French on the development of the liquid engine, for which went into PSLV. So
right.
that way, so technology development went on at different level at different times. So of course, the ultimate aim was to launch operational satellites, which was achieved with PSLV,
Yeah.
in the
As a,
90s. Yeah.
yeah. As a science journalist, you were at hand both for the ASLV D1 as well as the ASLV D2, which resulted in failures. In fact, you mentioned the fact that the joke was that always sea loving vehicle. Tell me, as a journalist covering the first one and second one, I think the second one had Rajiv Gandhi at hand, right? What was your sense as you saw things take off and then they fail?
No, it was of course, I mean, I was very young, and that was one of my first assignments
Right,
to go to Sriharikota. And I mean, there was a whole drill that you reach Madras, and then from there you're taken in a bus to Sriharikota, which was 100 kilometers away. And then you are there for the launch, and you're put in a control room. And of course, there are not many, restrictions at that time, so we could talk to scientists who were available to comment and all. But as it happens that you're watching away from the, obviously you're not in the control room, but there's a different place where you're seeing it on the screen to go up, and you're listening to the countdown. And of course, it was pretty clear that, I mean, you go out to see from the in the sky with the naked eye also. As soon as it is the countdown is zero, you run out and climb up the stairs and see. So that part was exciting. But very soon we could make out that it was going down, because you could see the thing coming down, and it was, there was a hushed silence, and I think it was a pretty sad atmosphere, because it was a new thing, after there was a gap between SLV and ASLV. So they thought it's going to be a very successful rocket, but something went wrong, and which I described what
Right.
was the problem. So yes, that was quite a disappointment, and it was watched by the Prime Minister. Then he came and patted the ISRO chairman. Yeah,
Right.
but yeah, the next time, of course, ISRO became slightly apprehensive of the press, and we were not allowed.
I know,
So
I read that, yes.
that was a bit disappointing. Yeah, but
Yeah.
that's
And also,
how they were also learning, in the sense how to deal with the press and what are the protocols, and there were a lot of. It also was driven by the person who is heading, because as long as Satish Dhawan was there, he was quite open, I suppose. I met him while he was still the director of IISc, but he had just resigned when I started covering space. I
I
mean,
see.
his term was just over, and you are now taking over. So that also reflects the personality of the person who is heading. Because see, as I was talking about the failures, and there were a lot of anecdotes which Kalam and others have called, that when things failed, Dhawan took the responsibility on himself, and he went out to the press and announced. But
Right.
when it succeeded, SLV, he put the project leader, which was Kalam, in front, and he allowed him to take the limelight. So that also reflects the kind of sagacity of the leadership which we had in the scientific agency. So it also reflects the kind of equations which people had, because when Kalam was made, they were not very murmurs, but because he was junior to several other
Right.
scientists when he was made the project director, but still everybody cooperated. But so when it succeeded, Satish Dhawan put him in front and let him take all the credit, which I think Kalam has recalled in the whole incident in his
Yeah.
autobiography. So yeah, they were learning to live, learning to deal with press, the public image, and all those political fallout. So for some time, there's Janta government was there, so there was a kind of crunch on program, some temporarily, yeah. So they
Yeah.
had to deal with all that, the public image of the program, because of course people do criticize when failures take place. Satish Dhawan was criticized in the American press. They mocked him, drew cartoons, because
Right.
the insect
I
was
remember.
sent up from US, and it failed after it was in the orbit. It was, so there are things like that. Yeah. So
You know,
ISRO was also trying to learn from all this,
soon
experience.
after that, Space for India acquired a somewhat different trajectory with the rise of Rakesh Sharma in 1984, becoming the first Indian cosmonaut, as it were, since he went through
Yes.
Russia, the Baikonur area. And then, of course, 13 years later, you had Kalpana Chawla, and the both heroism as well as the huge tragedy of
Yeah.
the Columbia disaster. And then you also bring in Sunita Williams. So it's the book is quite up to date. In fact, it's almost as if it was written yesterday in some ways, which is quite
Yeah.
remarkable. Tell me about how you approach these three figures of Indian space: Rakesh Sharma, Kalpana Chawla, and Sunita Williams. Especially Kalpana Chawla, because it was so tragic and yet so heroic.
No, there is sometimes, there's a feeling that should we celebrate astronaut? Of course, Rakesh Sharma was an Indian who went on a Soviet mission. But what
Right.
about Kalpana Chawla? They were American citizens. Sunita is an American citizen, and there are several others whom I talk about, Rajachari and quite a few others. And should we be celebrating their success, how Indian they are? There are kind of questions. Of course, Kalpana was born in India. She was educated. She studied engineering in Punjab and went to US to do her PhD and joined an American company, and then went on to NASA. So at least her parents were here, and she had Indian education, whereas Sunita was Sunita was born there. So should we? And she's half Indian. Mother is
Right.
different ethnic group. So should we celebrate? But so I don't feel that that question is relevant in the sense, because each astronaut's story is kind of an inspirational tale, I would say, because everybody had a different trajectory. Like Rakesh Sharma was a jet pilot. At
Right.
the age of 21, he was flying sorties in the 1971 war, and he was a trained pilot right from the beginning. So his transition to becoming an astronaut was very clear. But what about Kalpana Chawla? She had a great interest in space right from her childhood and her education. But then she went on to do a PhD. So she became an academic and then applied for a job. And then when the applications were called for NASA to become astronaut, she did apply and she got selected. So her path is totally different. What are the motivational factors for her? Again,
Exactly.
like Sonitya's story is totally different again. you know
I
so
mean,
I think each astronaut story has something for people to get interested in science and engineering and
absolutely.
technology, and individual stories of perseverance and to pursue your goals. So I think from that point of view, whether they are Indian or half Indian or it doesn't matter, I think that's what those stories need to be told. So from that point of view, I've included these stories. So, and of course, they are connected with the larger discourse of the missions in which they went out, the geopolitics of all that, the technological development of International Space Station, how this whole scenario has been changing.
Right.
So through those the stories of these people have tried to bring in the context, which gives a bigger picture, I would say.
In any case, scientific and technological achievements are not about ethnicity or nationality or gender. It's about just the fact that they were achieved. That's what it's about.
Actually,
But I was struck by a particular passage where in the context of Kalpana Chawla, you write that it was traveling at about 12,500 miles per hour speed and was 1,192 miles from its touchdown. That's when things began to unravel. At 9:20, you write, the mission control declared a contingency and a loss of communication, and then the Columbia disaster happened. It was quite in a tragic sense. It was quite a spectacle because a lot of people saw it. Uh,
that,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the the story tells us something, that how first mission was very successful and the second mission this happened and things were going on very well. It also points out that even a minutest thing can bring down a whole mission. For example, this particular tile which was noticed that it misbehaved while it was
Right,
going up the shuttle, and that's what ultimately led to this big disaster, that the heat started,
right,
penetrating the tail of the shuttle, and that's how this whole thing developed. So one cannot overlook, and of course, it points out to the not that it was a deliberate thing or it was, but it was a small thing which led to a big disaster. So the risk of space missions is there again, time and again. It's been established with the most recent with Sunita Williams' story also. Of course, their life was not at risk, but this whole uncertainty, there are still
absolutely.
unknowns. I mean, we have had so many missions, and 260 to 70 people have gone and lived on the International Space Station, and there's no threat to their life. Nobody has, had severe kind of life-threatening situations, but still, yeah, there are unknowns and risks, and that's what makes space technology so challenging. Despite all the technological advancements we have made, the knowledge, the latest materials, technology, the
Right.
ways to monitor, making the space the modules more habitable. I mean, earlier modules. There are a lot of comparisons. People have studied that how Russians used to take and how cramped they would be, and in fact. Sunita also went on one of the modules and she describes her missions in her blog. So we have made advancement, but still there are a lot of uncertainties and unknowns.
Right.
So every mission has one learns, I suppose,
Absolutely. Yeah. You know,
important from that.
to conclude, Dinesh, you also write extensively about the future in terms of the Gaganyaan mission, the first crewed or human space flight. What's the status of that?
See, it's on course in some ways because if you remember, I think it was announced in 2018
Right.
that by 2022 India will put an Indian in space, and that was supposed to be the 75th anniversary of the Indian independence. So that deadline is passed. At that time, it was announced that it will be 40 months. We can master that, but we can do that. But that has not happened, and but a lot of progress has been made in terms of training of the astronauts first in Russia, and now two of them are, as we talk, they're in US. One of them is going to go up and to International Space Station as part of the exam mission. The date has not been announced. So, an Indian from India, that goal still remains because I think there are a lot of steps we have to pass before we can really put the man-rated the GSLV Mark III is still to be tested. So because the module has to have the environment and life-saving support system, we are still to do that. The
Right.
training part has been done. I mean, everything you can't do here, but training has been done in Russia and now in America. But yeah, so I don't. I mean, ISRO has not given a date as when Gaganyaan is going to go up with an Indian. So, but they have laid out the path that there will be uncrewed missions of GSLV Mark III before that, but we are
Okay.
still to see that. But some building blocks they have tested, like the crew escape module, and a few building blocks have been tested, which is a long process. In fact, if you see the whole history of the human mission, it's been almost 20 years we've been talking about it from the idea till now. I mean, even
Absolutely.
if you take the 2018 deadline, we are already 4 years, and before that, a lot of work had been done. So it's something which is not to be hurried. I mean, China has done it and several others have done it, but yeah, let's not hurry. So I suppose that's the sense you get from ISRO that,
I
yeah,
see.
we'll have to go through all that. So, meanwhile, of course, an Indian will go up after Rakesh Sharma, that is
Okay.
Shubhanshu Shukla, but he's going to go up to ISS in an American satellite,
Yeah.
American module. Yeah. So I think we still have to wait for Gaganyaan to become
Okay.
a reality.
On that note, Dinesh, I want to thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to engage you on subjects of science. Like me, you are a nerd too, so always happy to do that.